Welcome to our exploration of inequity in higher education. While universities are often seen as meritocratic spaces where individual ability and effort determine outcomes, research reveals a more complex reality. Structural inequalities shape who succeeds and who struggles, impacting everything from curriculum content to student outcomes. In this video, we'll unpack the psychological and sociological mechanisms behind these disparities, examine how historical power relations persist, and discuss what can be done to create fairer educational environments. Let's begin by defining what inequity means and why it matters in the context of higher education. Inequity refers to systematic, avoidable, and unjust differences in outcomes between groups. Unlike inequality, which is about providing the same resources to everyone, inequity recognizes that some groups face structural disadvantages. These differences are produced by institutional structures, not individual abilities. In higher education, inequity can be seen in curriculum content, research production, staff representation, and student outcomes. Understanding this distinction is crucial for addressing the root causes of educational disparities. Equality means giving everyone the same opportunities, but equity goes further. It adjusts systems and practices to account for existing structural disadvantages, aiming for fair outcomes. In higher education, simply offering the same resources doesn't guarantee success for all. Equity requires recognizing and addressing the barriers faced by marginalized groups, ensuring that everyone has a genuine chance to thrive. This shift in perspective is foundational for meaningful change. Inequity in higher education manifests in several ways. Curriculum content often reflects dominant perspectives. Research production can be biased toward certain groups, staff representation lacks diversity, and student outcomes show persistent gaps. These manifestations are not random. They are shaped by historical and institutional forces. By examining these areas, we can better understand how inequity operates and identify opportunities for intervention. Key psychological mechanism underpinning inequity in higher education is the role of relevance in cognitive processing. Learning is not just about ability or effort. It's influenced by how relevant the content feels to the learner. When educational material reflects a student's identity and experiences, it's processed more deeply, remembered better, and leads to greater engagement. This cognitive foundation helps explain why some students excel while others struggle. Self-reference effect is a psychological phenomenon where individuals encode, process, and recall information more effectively when it is personally relevant. This effect operates through preferential attention, elaborative encoding, enhanced memory representation, and improved retrieval. When students see themselves reflected in educational content, their learning is more robust. Conversely, when content feels alien, engagement and recall suffer. Self-reference effect works through several cognitive processes. Preferential attention means self-related information captures our focus. Elaborative encoding integrates new material into our existing knowledge structures. Enhanced memory representation creates complex memory traces and associative links. Improved retrieval makes information easier to access and more resistant to forgetting. These mechanisms collectively boost learning when content is relevant to the learner. Research supports the self-reference effect. Studies by Rogers et al. Demonstrated superior recall for self-relevant information. Simmons and Johnson identified elaboration as a key mechanism, while Galley highlighted improved retrieval pathways. Barch and Oberauer confirmed long-term memory advantages. These findings show that learning is enhanced when content connects with students, identities, and experiences. Learning is not solely determined by ability or effort. It is significantly influenced by whether content feels relevant and reflects the learner's experiences. When educational material is culturally aligned with one group, that group benefits from enhanced cognitive processing. Students whose identities are not reflected experience reduced engagement, shallower processing, and weaker recall. This insight reveals that educational inequity is partly rooted in cognitive accessibility. Colonialized curriculum privileges Eurocentric perspectives, positions Western knowledge as universal, and marginalizes or excludes non-Western viewpoints. The structure of modern higher education is deeply influenced by colonial histories and European intellectual traditions. Early universities were dominated by white, Western men who defined what constituted valid knowledge. This legacy continues to shape what is taught and how it is taught. Colonialized curricula represent a form of systemic bias. Inequality is embedded within institutional norms and persists even without explicit discriminatory intent. Western perspectives are normalized, while others are marginalized. Certain students see themselves reflected in the curriculum, while others do not. This mechanism of inequity reproduces inequality through seemingly neutral teaching practices. It's important to note that universities are not inherently prejudiced institutions. However, passive acceptance of historical norms perpetuates inequity. Without critical examination of the roots of curricula, inequality continues to be reproduced. Addressing these issues requires intentional reform and a willingness to challenge established practices. Cultural relevance in education refers to the extent to which educational content reflects diverse identities, validates different lived experiences, and engages with issues relevant to marginalized groups. This concept is central to creating inclusive learning environments. When curricula are culturally relevant, they foster belonging, engagement, and motivation among all students. Cultural relevance enhances learning at both cognitive and social levels. Cognitively, it boosts encoding through the self-reference effect. Socially, it promotes belonging, engagement, and motivation. When students see their identities and experiences reflected in educational content, they are more likely to participate actively and feel valued within the academic community. Thomas and Quinlan studied 262 UK university students, measuring the cultural sensitivity of curricula and student engagement. They identified 4 dimensions of cultural sensitivity: representation of diversity, positive portrayals of minority groups, critical engagement with power and privilege, and inclusive classroom interactions. Their findings revealed that BAME students reported lower perceived cultural sensitivity and engagement. Study found that cultural sensitivity mediated the relationship between ethnicity and engagement. This means differences in engagement are not due to inherent student differences, but to differences in educational environments. When curricula lack cultural sensitivity, marginalized students are less engaged, highlighting the importance of inclusive educational practices. Key insight from Thomas and Quinlan's research is that cultural relevance is not an optional addition. It is central to effective learning. It benefits marginalized students by increasing inclusion and majority students by broadening perspectives. Creating culturally relevant curricula is essential for fostering engagement and success across diverse student populations. Structural constraints in psychological research contribute to inequity in higher education. Academics rely on existing research when designing curricula, so if research lacks diversity, curricula lack diversity. This creates a cycle where dominant perspectives are continually reinforced, limiting the scope and validity of educational content. Psychological research often relies on weird populations: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. These samples are treated as representative of all humans, despite lacking global validity. This bias limits the applicability of research findings and perpetuates inequity in educational content and practices. Roberts et al. Analyzed over 26,000 psychology articles and found that race is rarely examined, especially in cognitive psychology. The majority of authors, participants, and journal editors are white. This author, participant, and editorial bias creates a systemic cycle where research priorities reflect dominant groups, findings reinforce dominant perspectives, and curricula reproduce these biases. Lack of diversity in psychological research is not only an issue of representation, but also a threat to scientific validity. It limits the generalizability of findings and undermines the credibility of psychology as a discipline. Addressing these biases is essential for creating more inclusive and accurate educational content. Approximately 19.1% of UK university staff are from BAME backgrounds, with severe underrepresentation at senior levels. This lack of diversity creates a role model deficit, making it harder for students to identify with academic staff and envision themselves in similar roles. It also contributes to experiences of discrimination and psychological impacts, such as reduced belonging and increased self-doubt. Research by Wang et al. Shows that BAME students experience microaggressions and subtle forms of racism in higher education. These experiences reduce their sense of belonging, increase self-doubt, and lower academic confidence. Addressing discrimination is vital for creating supportive and inclusive academic environments. An et al. Found that people of color are underrepresented and less positively portrayed in teaching materials. These materials communicate implicit messages about who belongs and who contributes to knowledge. Lack of representation can lead to reduced engagement, lower participation, and decreased academic performance among marginalized students. Teaching materials that lack diversity send powerful implicit messages about who belongs in academic spaces. When students do not see themselves reflected, their engagement and participation drop, and their academic performance suffers. Ensuring diverse representation in materials is a key step toward fostering inclusion and success. The awarding gap refers to differences in degree outcomes between groups that cannot be explained by prior attainment. In the UK, there is an approximately 8.8% gap between BAME and white students, with larger gaps for Black students. This gap highlights structural inequities in curriculum design, representation, and teaching practices. The term attainment gap was replaced with awarding gap to emphasize institutional responsibility and avoid deficit framing of students. This shift recognizes that disparities are not due to individual shortcomings, but are symptoms of systemic inequity. Institutions must take responsibility for addressing these gaps. The awarding gap reflects structural inequities in curriculum design, representation, and teaching practices. These factors combine to create persistent disparities in academic outcomes. Addressing the awarding gap requires systemic reform and a commitment to equity at all levels of higher education. The awarding gap has academic, economic, and psychological consequences. Academically, it leads to lower degree classifications. Economically, it reduces employment opportunities. Psychologically, it lowers self-esteem and confidence. These outcomes reinforce the disadvantages faced by marginalized groups and highlight the urgent need for change. The awarding gap is a symptom of systemic inequity, not individual failure. Recognizing this shifts the focus from blaming students to addressing institutional structures. Effective solutions require a holistic approach that tackles the root causes of disparities in higher education. Decolonizing the curriculum involves critically examining Eurocentric bias and reconstructing curricula to include diverse perspectives. The aim is not to remove Western knowledge, but to expand and contextualize it. Decolonization covers content, pedagogy, and assessment, promoting inclusivity and challenging dominant narratives. The key aims of decolonizing the curriculum are to increase representation, challenge dominant narratives, and promote inclusivity. This process involves rethinking what is taught, how it is taught, and how learning is evaluated. Decolonization is about broadening perspectives and creating more equitable educational environments. Decolonization involves changes in content, pedagogy, and assessment. Content refers to what is taught, pedagogy to how it is taught, and assessment to how learning is evaluated. Inclusive assessment practices increase accessibility and engagement, making education more responsive to diverse student needs. Quinlan et al. Found that cultural sensitivity predicts student interest and engagement. Inclusive assessment practices further increase accessibility and engagement. These findings support the importance of decolonizing the curriculum for fostering student success and creating inclusive learning environments. Decolonizing the curriculum is not about removing Western knowledge. It's about expanding and contextualizing knowledge to include diverse perspectives. This approach enriches learning for all students and helps address systemic inequities in higher education. Students play a vital role in reducing inequity. Evidence from Wang et al. Shows that students recommend greater staff diversity, institutional commitment to anti-racism, curriculum reform, and increased support. Gutman and Yaunas highlight the importance of peer support, awareness, and community building. Listening to student voices is essential for effective change. Awareness and explicit discussion of race, privilege, and inequality are necessary to challenge misconceptions and promote critical thinking. Racism in higher education is often minimized, ignored, or viewed as irrelevant. Normalizing discussions about race improves inclusivity and prepares students for diverse societies. Challenging racism in higher education requires explicit conversations and institutional commitment. By addressing privilege and inequality head-on, universities can foster more inclusive environments and better prepare students for the realities of a diverse world. This process is ongoing and demands active engagement from all members of the academic community. Inequity in higher education is historically rooted, structurally maintained, and psychologically reinforced. Key mechanisms include cognitive relevance, structural bias in curriculum and research, and social factors like belonging and identity. Understanding these interconnected systems is essential for addressing educational disparities and promoting equity. Cognitive mechanisms, such as the self-reference effect, play a crucial role in learning. When educational content is relevant to students' identities, it enhances encoding, recall, and engagement. Addressing cognitive accessibility is a key step toward reducing inequity and improving educational outcomes for all students. Structural mechanisms, including curriculum and research bias, perpetuate inequity in higher education. These biases shape what is taught, how it is taught, and who is represented. Addressing structural inequities requires systemic reform and a commitment to diversity and inclusion at all levels. Social mechanisms, such as belonging and identity, influence student engagement and success. When students feel valued and included, they are more likely to participate and achieve. Creating supportive communities and fostering positive identities are essential for promoting equity in higher education. Inequity in higher education cannot be understood as a series of isolated issues. It is an interconnected system where cognitive processes, institutional structures, and historical power relations combine to advantage some students while disadvantaging others. Addressing inequity requires a holistic approach that considers all these factors. Creating equitable higher education environments involves multiple pathways. These include reforming curricula, increasing staff diversity, promoting cultural relevance, and challenging racism. Institutions must commit to ongoing reflection and action, listening to student voices and adapting practices to meet diverse needs. The journey toward equity is continuous and requires collective effort. As we conclude, remember that inequity in higher education is a complex, multifaceted issue. It is shaped by history, maintained by structures, and reinforced by psychology. Addressing it requires awareness, critical thinking, and a commitment to change. By understanding these mechanisms and working together, we can create more inclusive and equitable educational spaces for all.